Have you ever disliked something to the point of making it your punching bag? Something that you so desperately despise that you would want people to stop talking about it? Or simply, something you can't bring yourself to like, no matter what people tell you? For me, that something is Manpuku Jinja's own doujin anime, better known by the name of Fantasy Kaleidoscope, The Memories of Phantasm, or Memories of Phantasm for short. Releasing its first episode in 2011, this animation has brought itself a lot of attention due to its impeccable visual style that made it look like it was made in a professional studio rather than a doujin one. On top of that, it turned out to be one of the first animations made outside of promotional videos, the only other popular one at the time being Touhou Musokakyo, A Summer Day's Dream, released in 2008 by Maikaze, which presented some issues already. So it's only understandable that it gathered so much attention from the fans of the franchise. So why do I dislike it then? Is it because of its popularity? Of course not. Some things can be popular for good reasons, but the reason I dislike it over everything else is because the anime presents some major problems, not only scenaristically, but also right down to its most important aspects. Not only that, but most of those seem to be brushed over and accepted as such by a great number of people, even though they can be glaring faults at times. So, what are those issues and why are they so widely accepted? Let's not wait any further than that and dive right into it so I can show you why, in my honest opinion, this anime should not be so widely accepted as a good animated adaptation of Touhou Project. I believe the most important part of an anime is the animation, so let's start by talking about that. Or rather, let's first make the difference between animation, anime, and animatics. Most of those terms are seen as one and the same for the general public. However, there are major differences between the three, and we will need to know them in order to go further and not get confused when they'll be brought up. So, let's explain them right away. An anime is the final product that is given to us, most often being a Japanese animation. Of course it comes from the English animation, but it's similar to how we can call an animated movie a DreamWorks or a Pixar. In order to differentiate the two, I will use anime as the product itself. Animation is the action of making images move in a fluid manner. Of course that seems obvious, but it is a term that can be widely used throughout the world. I'm simply explaining this to separate it from the previous term. And finally, the animatics are rough sketches done to visualize the animation in a simpler manner. They do not contain the entire images but allow to synchronize voices with the actions that were drawn on the storyboard, by leaving a bigger or smaller gap between keyframes. It is in summary an important step in animation, and alternatively, animatics can also determine all of the smaller, simple drawings that are part of the anime itself, who can pop in and out without the need for a complex animation. Simply put, if you are looking at Iku here, you are looking at an animatic. You might be wondering why I've taken the time to list those three different terms, and there are two reasons for that. The first one being simple. A good drawing does not equal a good animation. And you'd be surprised to see a lot of freeze frames within the anime itself. Those usually impress because of their level of detail. However, most of them are considered drawings and not animation, and so even when part of an anime, those aren't really part of the animation itself. Once again, this does seem obvious, but you would be surprised how easy it is to make the mistake of saying that something is well animated only because it looks pretty. The second reason is because Memories of Phantasm uses animatics bountifully instead of using refined animations for some scenes. Aya coming in most of the scenes, some entrances like Yuyuko's and Yomu's hands in episode 1, Dayosa's in episode 5, Utsuo's in episode 7, Remilia's in episode 10, or even all of Nitori's movements while discussing with Marisa in episode 15 are all animatics. In fact, the same goes for most flying characters and most faraway scenes. Of course, I've not listed all of the examples, but this is one of the issues of the anime itself, as some of them are in the foreground, if not the center of attention, and all of it results in an uninteresting scene. However, you may argue that this adds a comedic effect to the movement, but it's still possible to create a comedic entry without the use of animatics, and this is mostly done by using several techniques that only cost a bit more time. Those slides and entrances stick out when watching closely and give an overall cheap look, which, in an anime is often cited as being greatly animated, pales in comparison to other scenes. But in truth, this is only the tip of the iceberg, as these are not the only scenes that do not respect the rules of animation that have been established by the industry itself. And speaking of animation rules, how about we talk about them regarding Memories of Phantasm? Those rules are in themselves essential to do a fluid and high quality animation. But of course I won't go over all of those, as it would take way too much time to check every single scene for every single rule. Instead, I'll explain the ones that really stood out from my very own perspective, explaining their purpose and reason for being the way they are, but mostly why Memories of Phantasm doesn't take advantage of them, and why it's detrimental for the anime in question. So, let's start by explaining timing, spacing, and easing. You may be thinking that I've just enunciated 3 different principles right now, and while they are so hard to separate that they're often put together. They aren't the easiest concepts to understand out of the bunch, but I'll try to do my best. Timing, spacing, and easing consist of making movement look either slow or fast. The timing determines the time or the number of frames in between each main key animation, and spacing is the movement made within between animation within this time frame. Easing, on the other hand, is the term used to describe the current timing and spacing used. To make this even more simple, you can imagine those 3 terms as a line with increments, also known as a time chart. Each increment represents a frame of animation. If the spacing and time of a scene is the same between every in-between, you'll get what's known as a linear interpolation, meaning that the movement will look the same throughout. By spacing and timing differently, you can make a scene, character, or even more look either slower or faster at the beginning or end, to give more emphasis to a movement. It can, for example, start slow and end quickly to make large movements. And so, now with the term explained, how does that apply to Memories of Phantasm? Well, saying that the rule isn't respected would be a flat-out lie. But most of the movements fall into the same category that we explained earlier, the linear interpolation. As such, most of the movements look the same without any difference. Take this scene from episode 7 of the anime, when Shurano tries to explain that she has seen a big creature to Reimu, Marisa, and Sanae. Reimu drinking her tea and, believe it or not, even Sanae getting excited, all have the same amount of spacing in between every keyframe. And while it doesn't show as much for Reimu as those are slow movements, it really shows when Sanae tries to be a part of the conversation. Same goes in episode 13 when, for example, Marisa is talking to Kane before being stomped on. Notice how one-note her movement feels? How her movement seems uniform from pose to pose. That's because she has the same amount of time in between every frame. There's no quick movement, no slow movement, everything goes at the same speed, and as such there is no different timing or spacing, which results in some incredibly sluggish movements. But while we're still on the subject, let's talk about a very important part of animation that also has something to do with in-betweens and spacing, namely smearing. And to explain what a smear is, I will be accompanied by Byakuren Hijiri. Hello Byakuren... alright, goodbye Byakuren, I suppose. You might not have noticed the smear, but let's slow down our movement and see it frame by frame. A smear in normal animation consists of blurring the motion of a character or object during a couple of frames to give it a sense of incredible speed. Here, for example, Byakuren dashes with such incredible speed that a smear is needed in between the keyframes of her animation to give the illusion of achieving such a feat. And yet, it all seems natural to our eye, as it is replacing what would normally be occupied by in-between frames. This is something that people often like to make fun of, because some smears can deform the characters so much that they become unrecognizable. But this is a necessary step in any kind of 2D animation, especially during fast-paced scenes. When it comes to Memories of Phantasm, though, smears are extremely inconsistent. In episode 1, they exist in some scenes, but aren't present in others where they would be needed. In episode 5, there aren't any of them, while the 6th one has some decent smears. And in episode 14, Aya's appearance lacks any kind of punch because of their non-existence, instead opting for a simple maple leaf transition. But in contrast, oh boy, we've got the smoothest way to hang up a phone. It's extremely jarring, as does usually take the space of normal in between frames, and as such do not ask for more time to be created, which makes their absence puzzling. Those are not the only examples, but this clearly shows that it is a recurrent problem, and this would have been fine if it was the only problem linked to animation. But unfortunately, there's way more than that. The next clearest example being the issue of strong design. When working on an animation, you obviously have to go through a multitude of steps before even attempting to draw the animation itself, in order to keep a decent amount of consistency. The most important step when it comes to the characters themselves is, well, it's all in the name really. The character design, which covers every single detail of every single character of the anime. Now, please excuse me as I don't have every single information regarding the characters for this anime, but I can only make do with what I have. And from what is shown within the art books and the anime in itself, most of the characters lack what is known as a strong design. A strong design, as the name implies, is what makes a character instantly distinguishable from another. Since characters are often done with simple shapes like circles, triangles, and squares, or even a mixture of those, it's often pretty easy to notice who is being presented, as well as their behavior and traits, just by looking at their silhouette. To get a good example out of Memories of Phantasm, let's take a look at this silhouette. Even while entirely in black, it's pretty easy to notice which character we have in front of us right now, with the hat, dress, and even sleeves giving it away. So much so, in fact, that even removing her accessories doesn't alter this, and still shows that Yuyuko is being presented here. Let's take another more polarizing design here to show the contrast. Who do you think this is? Some of you might have said that this is Sanae, others might argue that this is Reimu, but it's actually a bit of both. What I've shown you here is Reimu without a bow, and it shows a critical issue with most of Memories of Phantasm's designs. The body and facial features of most of the characters are the same, and they don't reflect the characters' personalities. To keep on going from our previous example, what brings the confusion here is that Reimu and Sanae both have the same dress and sleeves, but the same could be said about the eyes and chin. Most of the eyes only have a slight non-decipherable difference. In fact, I'm pretty sure you haven't seen me swap Remilia's eyes for Sakuya's in the last picture. And by that, of course, I just mean that I've inverted the colors. The characters who especially have it rough when it comes to that are the secondary characters. Whether it be Alice and Yuka having the same hair, or Yuka and Yukari having the same eyes, or even better, all of them having the same face. It clearly shows that those are the ones who suffer the most from the detailed character design of the anime. An interesting point to bring up would be that, even though they might not all have distinguishable differences, they are still recognizable to our eyes. And that is due to the fact that most of the appeal of the characters already comes from Jun's designs. Even if they're not really well drawn in the first place, but that's a completely different thing. Long story short, very few characters have a distinct, strong design in Memories of Phantasm. And while this might seem like a minor issue, it quickly turns into a massive one when pairing it with the fact that we are in an anime. And as such, in order to give fluid movements, those designs have to squash and stretch. Now, this is one important rule to follow in order to give impact and flow to anything appearing on screen. Squashing and stretching. Of course, the more squashed and stretched your character appears, and the more distorted and floaty they will seem. The amount of squashing and stretching simply depends on how unrealistic you want things to look to the human eye. One important thing, however, is that no matter how far you want to take this principle, it still has to stay within the boundaries of the character design, which is why I previously stated shapes like squares, circles, and triangles as being important. Otherwise, going too far will make your characters or object look off, and most importantly, it will make them deviate from what's been established. There's one exception to that rule, however, and that only comes whenever joints need to be broken up in order to exaggerate emotion even more. This is most often used in animations whenever fights are occurring or quick missions need to be performed. Because the character design of Memories of Phantasm is extremely detailed in general, which, mind you, isn't a bad thing, it's a deliberate choice from the character designer, making characters move in a more cartoony and animated manner asks for a lot more effort, and in general, a lot more manpower. Any misstep could lead to them becoming off-model or stiff, which is what happened for most of episode 7 actually. This elaborate character design therefore makes any kind of movement delicate, and in some, this is also why the anime doesn't have a lot of fight scenes or a lot of extravagant gestures for that matter, because those demand a lot more squashing and stretching. Compare this to another anime which is also based on Touhou Project, Musokakyo, A Summer Day's Dream. The simpler character design here allows for smoother movements and more exaggerated poses, which results in bouncy and lively scenes like this one with Raisin. Now, some of you might be saying that characters being more static makes them look and feel a bit more realistic, but I would tend to disagree for this anime in particular. The reason being that Memories of Phantasm wants to look like a shonen anime. And just in case you don't know what that means, a shonen is by definition a medium that targets a male audience. In fact, that's the meaning of the word shonen, with the opposite of that genre being a shoujo anime. Thing is, shonen manga or animations tend to be action-packed, often focusing around fights, sports, challenges, and plenty of different abilities. That can be seen in both the structure of Memories of Phantasm, but most prominently in the recaps that are done at the beginning of most of the episodes, which are directly lifted from Dragon Ball Z. In fact, even the music is adapted from it. Those type of animations need to move a lot, and so having an extremely detailed character design makes it all the more difficult. Hence why shonen anime often have big teams working on them. The bodies of the characters need to squash and stretch. They need to move in a flowing manner. And in Memories of Phantasm, they most often don't, by either avoiding the scenes where they would have to, or giving them very little movement, which makes most scenes look drawn out. Which hopefully is not a sign of whatever problems there are. But for the time being, let's talk about another aspect of the movement that isn't respected here. Namely, arcs and lines of action. These probably aren't gonna be the easiest thing to convey and explain either, but let's give it a shot. Whenever a movement is created for an animation, for example an arm swing or a ball falling, it needs to follow a curved path in order to seem natural to our eyes. This path is named an arc. And although it might seem like it, it's not a principle exclusive to animation. It's present in any kind of medium where drawing is a thing, whether they are comics, manga, or animations. To make this clearer, let's go back to Antinomy of Cone Flowers and take a look at Mamiza's sprites. More specifically, her introduction pose. Starting by looking at this animation, we can see that there's much more than one arc present. So to make this matter simpler, we are going to isolate one. And by that, I mean that we are going to look at her tail, since it's pretty much the focal point of her body. Drawing the arc of her tail during the introduction pose roughly looks like this, and you can see how many curves we're going through to make a couple of movements, sometimes even going as far as doing a loop because our tail flips sides. This arc allows our tail to flow freely while our body leans over, and it gives us a natural animation. Lines of action, on the other hand, are only mostly used for the characters themselves, as those define their current attitude. It's often represented by a line going from their feet up to their head, but can sometimes vary, and curving said line in many different ways, allowed to create much stronger and flexible poses. Once again, it'll be hard to explain without an example, so let's get back to Mamizo. And for that, we are going to take two powerful poses. The first one where she bashes her opponent with a bottle, and another one where she delivers a sweeping kick. In those two poses, there are two lines of action. The red line defines her body stance, and we can see how it works along with the movements, as when she deals the blow, she tries to keep her balance by either raising her left leg or putting her arms back. And the fact that she does this is what makes the moves look so powerful upon impact. In general, if the balance is conserved for a character's lines of action, this will allow them to show all of the built-up momentum or even their strength at a certain point in time. The blue line, on the other hand, is here to tell you that this element will move in the same way as the red line does, only in a delayed manner, because something like a tail is obviously lighter. An important use of those lines allow for characters to feel much stronger or, alternatively, much weaker depending on their stance. And this in turn is something essential for much more than just fight scenes. So, what about Memories of Phantasm? How does it fare with both of those rules? If your first guess was not well, then let me reassure you, you are more or less right. Now, bear with me. It's not awful, but as always, it's extremely inconsistent. Take the example of Marissa using a satellite illusion spell card in episode 8. Her right arm moves forward in order to direct her attack, while the other one leans back. However, the attack lacks punch because while the lines of action are well done, this is not the case of the arcs, with both arms not moving forward and back enough to make it believable. And in the same episode, we actually have a good pose while Reimu shoots some Fuda at Marissa. The pose in itself isn't sensational, but the arcs that her arms follow shows some real anticipation and recoil from her movements, allowing it to feel natural. An example of both a good pose and good arcs can once again be found in episode 8, where Marissa shoots a Master Spark. Her broom and herself move to counter the force generated by the mini Hakero, which looks powerful, because her body is trying to keep its balance, and it's amplifying the impact of the scene. The only real downside to it is that there's a lack of recoil from the hit itself. But on the flip side, while most of them look like good examples, you have the complete opposite in the form of episode 11, where there's little to no balancing from the characters themselves. It's quite easy to notice this whenever characters start flying, and there is no force lifting them from the ground. It's even easier to notice in that episode because of its lack of strong movements, and as such, its lack of strong poses. To top it off, it's extremely rare to see a character under the hip in this one, and so it's also exceedingly hard to get a good pose or some fluid movements out of them. And for a concrete example, you can once again look over to Marissa while she fires a Master Spark in episode 16. That being said, one of the reasons why characters are rarely fully shown might not just be because of arcs and lines of action being few and far between, but also because of another rule: primary and secondary action. Let's move on to another quite important part of animation as a whole. Primary and secondary action is perhaps one of the easiest concepts to grasp. It consists in saying that if something is moving in an animation, everything linked to it needs to flow in the same manner and follow the movements. We have something of the sort with Mamizo's tail, but for a more visual example, let's grab another character from the cast of Antinomy of Common Flowers. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the sweet and bouncy Doremi. Now, if you please. During her down special animation, she gives us a great example by bouncing on a dream. See, the primary action here is Doremi bouncing, but the secondary one is all of the movements done by her hat, tail, and clothing in general. It's important to make the distinction between the two because one is following another, and so, if done wrong, or not done at all, it can create a real disconnect between the character and the environment it moves in. And would you be surprised if I told you that this often happens in Memories of Phantasm? Nah, you're surely accustomed to it at that point. Simply put, most of the things that are attached to the characters themselves do not move, or if they do in a repetitive manner. In episode 1, you can easily see this with Yuyuko's dress flowing in the same manner when it should be pushed towards the tree because of the wind. Episode 5 shows Aya with moving clothes, but with wings that aren't being flapped while she's flying. Episode 9 shows us that Eirin has a very bad case of stiff hair. Episode 13 has Tei showing us that gravity is indeed a man-made invention, and that skirts do not respect any laws of physics. And finally, in episode 16, Aya's hat has grown a mind of its own and defies gravity as well. Those issues might seem small, but the more they add up and the more visible they become, to the point where it becomes easier to spot them than to follow the plot. I understand that some slip-ups can happen, but as seen before, it's quite a regular occurrence. And because of the already apparent stillness of the characters, it really reinforces that feeling of immobility. And truly, it's not the only factor that contributes to it. Let's conclude this part talking about the animation with two other tacit rules: acting and staging. Now, those two aren't that difficult to explain, so let's start by doing so for staging, as this is normally one of the first things that is thought of during the making of an animation. Simply put, staging is a part of the storyboard where each scene is thought of and built. It is there that everything such as the angle of the shot, space in between the characters, the location, and everything else is determined, and it's necessary in order to locate where the characters are, but most importantly, where the scene takes place. A good scene composition can allow for really dynamic shots, while a bad one will make the scene look boring. To demonstrate the importance of staging, let's pick a scene from the first episode of Memories of Phantasm, namely, the scene where Marisa enters Hakigakura all up to the fight between her and Yamu. By now you'd probably expect me to say that all of the staging is badly done, but in truth, it's not bad at all. But it can be executed in a much better way. Starting when Marisa is at the bottom of the stairs, we have a panning shot of Akigakura's long staircase, indicating that it is going to be a long climb. The problem here is that it doesn't show any reaction from Marisa herself. There's no shock factor, even though this is the first time she sees the stairs. As such, it doesn't correctly convey this idea of a towering staircase as it was probably meant to be shown. This in turn also prevents Marisa's determination from being correctly shown, as she instead simply shrugs off this turn of events as if it was nothing. Still, the way things are shown convey the idea of the place being big, but the question now is, how can this scene be improved to give a much more impactful feeling? Well, starting from the moment she enters Hakigakura, the idea of rotating the scene is, frankly, pretty good. However, it can also be used to showcase the environment around Marisa as seen here, all the while showing a reaction to what just happened with an expression of surprise. Following this, the camera then zooms out, revealing the towering staircase from Marisa's perspective before zooming out even more, giving out a global shot of Hakigakura. This reinforces the idea that this place is gigantic and that climbing the stairs is going to be a long endeavor. And finally, after exposing the scene and the location, we've got a shot of Marisa's hand, showing her hesitation as she then proceeds to boast and start walking towards the top. This version is still not perfect, but it shows more reaction on the behalf of Marisa, who is the character we have been following since the start of the episode. And it also shows that, while present, the staging in Memories of Phantasm stays pretty basic all the way through. This can be seen with a scene from episode 14 when Aya is discussing with Marisa in her house. During this entire section, not a single global shot is shown to locate our deuteragonist in the world of Gensokyo, and the only way to know what's currently shown to us is the dialogue. Of course, we know that they are in the Yokai Mountain because we know the setting of the games. But take it from the perspective of a newcomer, and you'll soon realize that something is missing. Naturally, there are plenty of other staging issues I could pick out and explain, but going over every single one would take ages. So, for the time being, let's explain the principle of acting instead. And to go over that, I'll be accompanied by Marissa. Hey, Marissa! Marissa! Hey! I suppose I'll be explaining it alone then. We'll come back to her later to see how she's doing. Acting, as the name implies, is the way a character moves depending on their personality. Usually, when moving, a person gives hints to their personality without even knowing. Let's take some poses from the first Touhou fighting game, Immaterial and Missing Power, which, on top of already being pretty communicative by themselves, will change from antinomy of Common Flowers sprites. Reimu's idling animation is a good example of her behavior. While her face depicts her as serious and ready to fight, her body conveys the same emotion, since her chest is shown sticking out from the rest of her body, which is often seen as a hero pose. It makes her seem as if she's confident and ready to endure whatever is coming at her. Put her next to Suika, and you can immediately see how much serious she seems, even though it's not hard to guess why. Suika, on the other hand, seems a lot more goofy because of the way she and her arms wave back and forth, almost having trouble keeping her balance. A couple of her poses even show her in what could be called a joyful pose, with her arms and legs stretched out. It shows that she doesn't care about the situation and that she doesn't take the battle seriously. And this is the power of acting, and it works the same way in classic animations. However, acting is also applied when the character isn't the center of attention to keep that illusion of reality alive, to make it seem as if the character isn't just a drawing, but a living, breathing part of the world they are in. So, now that we're done with the explanations, how about we go back to Memories of Phantasm to check how our friend Marissa is doing? Marissa, are you still there? See, this is one of the main problems of Memories of Phantasm. Acting is far from being a thing. In fact, most of the time, characters don't move at all when they're not the main focus. I've already shown you the example of Marissa in episode 5 and 7, but in the latter, Sanae, Chirano, and even Reimu herself are victims of this, staying immobile when it's not their time to speak. Other examples include, but are not limited to, Episode 8 when Marissa is talking to Kene and Alice simply ceases to exist. Episode 11 when Sakuya is seen together with Remilia and most of the background characters, who are also at the standstill. Otherwise, most of the movements are extremely homogeneous, and there isn't much to differentiate a character from the others by a simple look at their body language, with only a couple of exceptions withstanding. I'll admit that Chirano is the most expressive character when it comes to her movements. But as promised, I'll stop criticizing the animation here, because going much further in depth would just make this video even longer, and besides, listing all of the examples wouldn't make much sense. But nonetheless, I hope you now understand why the animation of Memories of Phantasm doesn't feel all that exciting to watch. That being said, we aren't exactly done with the anime itself. There are a couple of other things I want to talk about before giving out a conclusion. So let's leave the animation segment aside and talk about the issues with the presentation and pacing. Another main issue that I found within Memories of Phantasm was both the presentation and pacing of the series itself. I'll start by explaining the latter in order to keep things consistent. Pacing in itself is quite easy to understand. It consists in keeping a regular pace in between the different phases of an animation in order to keep action, or more simply, the plot going. And in regards to that, Memories of Phantasm fails in two critical categories. The first and most glaring one is that episodes are extremely short, only averaging 14 minutes counting every episode, instead of the usual 20 to 22 minutes of a regular anime. In normal terms, this would be an advantage, as this would allow more work to go towards the animation. But that's clearly not the case, as we've seen before. So, what's the problem with this exactly? Well, it all comes down to effective time. In a classic Japanese animation, those minutes are occupied by a lot of stuff. Some summaries of older episodes, as well as the opening and ending of the anime, on top of the normal and never before seen animation. And wouldn't you know, Memories of Phantasm does the same thing. However, if the average time for an episode becomes 14 minutes here, the way an episode is built looks a bit more like this. I'll spare you the entire process, since that'd be pretty boring, all things considered. But a lot of openings here are reused, and a lot of episodes have recaps of older ones that last for a long time. In total, that means that throughout all of the anime, which lasts 13,952 seconds or about 232 minutes, around 2,791 seconds or 46 minutes and 31 seconds are reused. That's a percentage of 20% of reused content, or exactly a ratio of 1/5 of the animation being repurposed. Now, reusing animation is nothing wrong, it's quite common in Japanese animation in fact. But the issue here is that we already have smaller episodes, getting shorter and shorter the more the episodes go on. And not only that, but since those parts have already been used, they are often skipped by viewers, meaning that on top of filling a lot of the animation artificially, it's often a pace breaker. Not to mention, but episodes are still sold at a hefty price, no matter their length. In fact, this also brings up something else. Since episodes are short in comparison, story arcs such as the Imperishable Night one can last ages before coming to an end, lasting 6 full episodes here, even though it could fit in 2 or 3 regular episodes had the episodes been longer. It's something that I've tried to fix in the Blu-ray releases, where episodes are condensed to prevent those issues. But I'm basing myself on the most well-known version here, which is the DVD release. But speaking of breaking the pace, here comes the second problem. Memories of Phantasm doesn't know how to read the mood of the current situation. And ironically, this is due to the first issue. Since there's a lot less time to work with here, it's impossible to set up a correct scene and make it have a long-lasting impact in your memory. And this results in a lot of emotional clashing. Taking this scene with Kaguya having her schemes discovered by Sakuya in episode 13, the atmosphere until then had been pretty tense. But unfortunately it gets broken up by silly faces. Another example would be episode 10, where after a cliffhanger in episode 9 showing Marisa being in a dire situation, she immediately gets saved without any repercussions, all the while changing the mood of the scene to a jovial, unimportant one. And for a final example, there's even Aya's fight in episode 15, where even though the scene starts by presenting itself as a normal fight, it quickly devolves into another comical scene. Without any surprise, these clash with one another and prevent any kind of situation from being established. Is it supposed to be serious? Comical? Since it swaps between the two non-stop, it unfortunately doesn't work and prevents the show from being enjoyable, from both the canon and fanon perspective. In one case, the constant mood swings and other jokes will make it tiresome as well as predictable, and in the other, there just won't be enough substance to keep watchers going. Why is there a lack of substance? Well, I'll gladly elaborate on that. Starting with the thing that might stick out in the eyes of the first-time viewers, the inclusion of Sanae in a lot of incidents where she isn't supposed to be involved. Seeing how the anime tries to replicate the games in some way, shape or form, it would seem normal to see her at some point, only to periodically come back into the plot later on as she appeared. Here, however, she's seen since the first episode and keeps appearing, showing that she either gets along pretty well with the main cast already, or she simply doesn't know them yet. Most episodes have been shown to not be in the game's order, with Embodiment of Scarlet Devil even being told in the form of a flashback, reinforcing this idea. as Sakuya is being friendly to Reimu in the first episode, which corresponds to Perfect Cherry Blossom, while she isn't in episode 3, which corresponds to Embodiment of Scarlet Devil. And so, in episode 14, Sanae shows that she doesn't know Reimu, treating her as a complete stranger and competition to her shrine, even if she appeared in episodes which are supposedly numbered before this from the anime's perspective. From the point of view of a person who doesn't know the games, or Touhou as a whole for that matter, this creates this awkward situation where she seems to have an extreme case of mood swings. I understand that Manpuku Jinja wanted to create a backstory for her through the different games and show how she came to settle in Gensokyo, giving her some characterization. But there are many other ways to do it. By doing it in one segment at the end of episode 6 instead of only just showing Kanako, not doing it at all and amplifying the mystery until the reveal in the episode she first appears in, or even doing the episodes in the game's order and placing that backstory in a game where there's not a lot to say in the first place? You may be telling me that this animation was made with one fact in mind. Everyone that will watch this will know what Touhou is about. But this is problematic, as people getting into the series through this mean won't get the story. This is especially troublesome during episode 16, where they try to make Sanae's arc important and center stage, even though it was completely spoiled from the get-go after episode 2. I'll give them credit for trying to come up with something, but other plot points fall right through because of that skewed episode order. Byakuren's liberation from Makai teased at the end of episode 4, never shown again in between episode 5 to 17, which is the latest episode at the time I'm writing this video. It's a complete blunder, and it shows one of the biggest problems with characters in general. They are here for the sake of being present. I was speaking about Embodiment of Scarlet Devil earlier, but if you take the way Flandre was added into the main story, it actually makes a bit of sense. However, that still doesn't explain her appearance in other scenes like episode 11, episode 12, or even episode 7 where she's in broad daylight. I mean, sure, she's protected by a small parasol, but was she really needed here? Worst scenario, this happens with a lot of characters, whether they are in the background or not. Of course, you could make those pass off as cameos in order to please people with a bit of fan service. But it's not just cameos we're talking about here. Some characters up to stage 4 get pushed to the sideline because of this mentality. Episode 1 sees Letty, Chen, Alice, and the Prism River sisters completely set aside, only being shown for a couple of seconds. The same goes in episode 2, where Rumia, Chirono, and Mei-Ling get dispatched in less than a minute. And if you want a recent example, the Aki sisters and Hina? You can wipe them out of your memory. They don't exist for more than 10 seconds on screen. Once again, this is something done because episodes are short. But on top of forcing some characters in your face, this makes others seem unimportant, even though some of them have an impact in their original story. It truly is a shame, but unfortunately, this is also how the anime was built in the first place. And this makes it feel hollow. It's almost as if there was a checklist to follow in order to make an episode. Hence why I'm saying that it lacks substance, because characters don't get much in terms of development or exposition, because there's no time for such things. After all, why would you build a coherent world if you're going to stuff it with silly faces, comical fights, and with characters who are treated like cameos? But I could keep nitpicking on a lot of things regarding the presentation, pacing, or animation, and it still wouldn't change a thing. Even showing stuff that sticks out like a sore thumb, like the sore thumb of Komachi using the wrong brush size, Aya and Ittori completely skipping frames of animation, the anime using a soft and slow white fade out for Yomu getting knocked out, or even the music sometimes being inappropriate, like in the fight against Eirin, it wouldn't lead us anywhere. Rather, I need to admit something here. I've been a bit dishonest regarding Memories of Phantasm. I don't hate it for what it is, although all of the issues that I listed beforehand are true, but rather for what it isn't. Or more precisely, for what it could have been instead. Let me explain what I mean by this. Let's say that you are watching Memories of Phantasm, and you are currently reaching episode 7. You are starting the episode and notice that it's going to be pretty much the same thing, with the subpar animation and plot. So much so that you are starting to feel a bit bored. And then, this part of the episode kicks in. Let's rewind this so we can observe that one more time. Everything is right in there in that scene. Impact, anticipation, smearing, squash, and stretch. You can even feel Chudeno's feeling of being powerless against Tetsuo. And then it goes back to the normal animation seen throughout the anime. And this, for me, is the issue regarding Memories of Phantasm. There are a couple of the scenes showing that the anime can be good, but it never goes all the way to create a spectacle. Actually, there seems to be a particular attention to detail during the openings, but not the episodes themselves. Some people might tell me that this type of animation is called Sakuga. And I really hate that word. Not just because Sakuga undermines what animators do, but also because it overshadows the reason why every single animation cannot be like this. That and the openings being created separately and sold before this contradicts this, but anyway, I'll come back to that word in a bit. Rather, let's ask ourselves a question here. If the animation can be that good all of the time, but it isn't, what is preventing it from being that way? In my eyes, there are 3 different issues that make this situation impossible. The first one, and the easiest to understand, is the fact that Memories of Phantasm needs to stay relevant in the eyes of its viewers. And by staying relevant, of course, I mean that it needs to be released quite often in order to keep captivating the attention of those who follow it. Looking at the release dates of the different episodes, we can see that the medium gap in between them is around 7 to 8 months. While it would seem like an enormous gap for commercial animations, it isn't so big for a fan-made anime. In fact, looking at other animations made for Touhou, you can quite clearly see that it is a very short time span compared to others. Now, of course, time doesn't always amount to quality. But in the case of Memories of Phantasm, we have clearly seen that it would be the case. So, why don't they take more time to do it? Well, it's not just because of relevancy, but also because of the second reason. The way animation has evolved throughout the years and how anime is now consumed as a medium. See, in its early years, animation was far from the way it is today. At first, it was considered a niche, and so very few anime were produced and aired. And by extension, not a lot of people knew about anime to begin with. But as the years went on and the digital distribution of animations became more common, they in turn became more and more mainstream. In the eyes of many, this might seem like a bad thing, but as with any evolution, it has its shares of ups and downs. One of the undeniable side effects of this evolution, however, was the increase of anime production, as the demand for them grew even further each decade. And this can easily be seen by comparing the number of television-produced anime throughout the years. Whereas they were reaching 28 different anime in general throughout a year in the 1980s, this number grew larger at the end of the 1990s, with big shows such as Pokemon, Dragon Ball, and Sailor Moon hitting a younger demographic, with an average of 40 anime produced in a year. It then kept growing steadily until the 2000s, until reaching a peak in the 2010s with an average of 166 shows produced per year for television alone. And with so many shows to watch, standing out amongst the crowd can turn out to be extremely difficult. Hence why it's important for an anime to be regular in its release schedule and generate hype. Because it is impossible for someone to watch all of the anime that are released within a year nowadays. Of course, the evolution is not the problem here, since most animations that are done that way are products that have often been planned by corporations beforehand. So releasing episodes on a weekly basis isn't an issue for them. Here, however, we are talking about a doujin studio. So the question to ask ourselves here is, does Manpuku Jinja consider their creation like a product or a work of passion? This question is rhetorical, obviously. A doujin circle would never create an anime for something they do not like. But in truth, it's still a bit of both, since they follow the standards set for normal animation studios. And now, this leads us to our third and last reason why Memories of Phantasm is stuck the way it is: the economical model that it follows. Whenever a studio creates an animation, the pivotal factor that will determine everything, way before any drawings are done, is the budget available for its entire creation. Historically, the goal of a Japanese animation after the 1950s has always been to create movement with as little funds as possible. And as time passed on, their budget gradually became bigger, along with the workload that was put upon the animators. However, since once again we are talking about a doujin animation studio, those budget constraints are much closer to how much their creators can invest in it. But, as seen before with the animation, their budget does not seem limitless. Of course, I could blame Manpuku Jinja on this one, telling them that they don't invest enough in their anime and simply do more tasteless nittery jokes. But the truth of the matter is that making an animation is extremely expensive. And I don't think that's a secret to anyone. There aren't many details on how the budget is spent. However, judging by the diminishing pool of animators throughout the series, it is clear that Memories of Phantasm has a hard time staying afloat, especially when the only source of revenue they truly have, unlike regular anime I've cited earlier, are the DVDs and other merchandise linked to the anime itself. It might have had more benefits at the beginning, but since then, the anime has been going on for more and more time, even celebrating its 10th anniversary in 2021. Thus, fans are, ironically, perhaps just tired of it after seeing so many short episodes that have trouble getting to the end of their respective stories. Granted, it's not the only factor, as many later episodes show that coloring and in-betweening have been done by external studios to save up on costs. But it only partially excuses animation mistakes, since key animations and therefore planning is still done in-house. In the end, the reason they wanted to go the way they did only regards them. It isn't really interesting to the viewer itself. However, it does have an impact. They can't afford to stay out of relevancy for very long after all, regardless of how well their finances are, which puts them into a vicious cycle. As long as the anime will need relevancy, the economical model of Manpuku Jinja won't be able to take a spin and won't allow them to try something else. But because it keeps being relevant, although not enough to make a profit and bring in new fans, they are forced to lower their quality standards, bring more money from their own pockets, in order for them to be relevant once more and try again. And while it partially explains the deterioration of episodes going forward, it does not do the same for the quality spikes that you can see throughout. And as I come back to it, this is also why I sincerely hate using the word sakuga, because it only focuses on the good scenes and ignores the bad and what consequences they might have. It does not really encourage the animators to do a good animation throughout and only focus on one scene instead. However, much like any job related to art, that isn't the only drive they have while creating animations. Before anything, art is a passion. And this is why I simply cannot blame Manpuku Jinja for their choices regarding their economical model. However, what I'm saying, even though it sounds pretty idealistic, is that a part of the animation should not be suffering simply because another one needs to look spotless, and as such, gets a bigger part of the budget. And in the case of Memories of Phantasm, I don't believe a big part of the anime should suffer for 15 seconds of pure visual pleasure. Of course, it doesn't need to move like crazy all the time, as some slow scenes are necessary, but you know what, enough about Sakuga. I think you got the idea. Rather, now that we know both the issues of Memories of Phantasm and why those issues are a thing in the first place, a question remains. Does Manpuku Jinja need to break this vicious cycle in order to improve? The answer is, not forcefully. There are some other ways. With the first one being to diminish the number of frames used for some scenes in order to relieve animators of some rather cumbersome work. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Won't reducing the amount of frames make the animation look choppy? And surprisingly, no, it won't always be the case. If we go back to all of the rules that I've explained to you earlier on, you may have noticed that I've used Antinomy of Common Flowers sprites quite often to demonstrate them. However, most of those sprites don't have a lot of frames when it comes to movements. For example, Raisin's dash attack only has 7 frames, while Moko's introducing animation only has 9 of them. And even with the game being at 60 frames per second, you can clearly feel the impact of her strike. Traditional animation is often said to be around 24 frames per second. However, that is more a myth than a reality. Sure, the frame count is set to 24 frames, but the focus of attention is often in between 8 to 12 frames, while the people in the background are in between 6 to 8 frames per second. In the event of Memories of Phantasm though, it's often 1 frame for the poor people in the back. It sounds like a very low amount of frames, but it still stays fluid to our eyes because things like good smears and good body movements are applied and allows our eyes to fill in the blanks. Simply put, if an animation can look fluid in 8 frames, there's no need to make it more complicated. And by applying this low frame strategy on some scenes, this would allow the animators to focus on other scenes and make them far more interesting and far less bare bones. That being said, this would ask for a second more direct change to the animation team. Now, I'm not saying that some people should be fired or whatever. After all, it's a doujin circle, so it's mostly passionate. But it should be noted that throughout all of the episodes that have been made up to this point, only 19 known people have been working on the in-between animation, while 36 different people have been assigned to key animation. And if you followed me up until this point, you pretty much know what's the problem here. In-between animation is what makes the character convincing while moving, and by definition, it asks for a lot more manpower since there's more to produce. Key animation, on the other hand, while important, still has less frames to output, and seeing that the staff assignment pretty much contradicts this makes it obvious why so many corners are cut. But in the end though, there's no miracle technique, as it's all dependent on the skill of the animators themselves. But taking these things in consideration could help them create a better, yet quicker to produce animation. And after all, what's the goal of an animation if not to look good to the eyes of the audience? But instead of drawing this out even more, let's conclude and let me give you my last thoughts about it. So, here we are, about to give a conclusion to this anime as a whole. However, before we do that, let me add a last detail. When I was criticizing the animation, the presentation, the pacing and so on earlier, you might have noticed that I often try to get different examples from different episodes. But there are 3 in particular that I haven't or barely talked about. Those episodes being the 3 dedicated to Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, episode 2, 3, and 4. And the reason for that is because those episodes aren't half bad. To be truthful, they look quite good. There are a couple of issues here and there, but for the most part, they are pretty enjoyable. But if the rest of the anime is so brutally different, then why are those 3 episodes exempted from most of the issues I've listed earlier? In 3 words, they were planned. It's easy to overlook this, but Memories of Phantasm started with its first episode in 2011, with episode 2 only following in 2013. However, in the opening of the first episode, it's already possible to see the final fight with Emilie and Flandre from episode 4, and even the fight scene against Sakuya in episode 3, meaning that episode 2 to 4 had more than 2 years to be finalized, contrary to the other episodes, who have been succinctly released every 7 to 8 months after the last one was out for sale. And this can be seen as the other episodes do not show a preview of a further one like this ever again, which makes it feel like none of them after the 4th one were actually planned, aside from the openings, or that they are just done right after one is completed. And if I needed to summarize Memories of Phantasm in a sentence, while taking everything that I've said up to this point, that's pretty much what I would end up saying. This anime does not feel planned. At least, not for the long term. Some parts of it look pretty for sure, and I don't want to deny that some people spent a good amount of time working on this. But most of the animation looks downright mediocre, and because of the messy production, strange portrayal of the characters, hasty releases, and mostly untapped potential of some scenes, it isn't an anime you can recommend to newcomers or people within the fandom. Of course, I do not doubt that some of you might be fans of this anime, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, maybe you see something in it that I don't. Perhaps you simply see me as overly critical towards an anime which only has the pretension of animating a rather well-known doujin series with the current standards of the industry. And you know what? That is a perfectly fair point. Although, forgive me if this makes me sound like an entitled prick, but don't you think that Touhou deserves somewhat better when it comes to anime? Of course, the beauty of Touhou is that anyone is able to do anything, with varying levels of quality, and therefore different ideas and goals. It's been the case for many years now, and it will hopefully never change. I also understand you cannot predict success, but even then, nothing forces you to answer the demand that you've created right away. You can wait and make the anime the best it can ever be instead. I'm not even thinking of an overly detailed animation either, as I've pointed out before. Episodes such as the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th were more than enough. In fact, episode 17, for how short it was still perfectly acceptable. Naturally, this feeling completely depends on your relation to Touhou Project, as well as how much you enjoy it in the first place. However, one issue that is completely separated from this is that Memories of Phantasm is an entire package, not just a few select minutes or episodes. Therefore, even if it's been capable of granting this idea of quality through many of its aspects, it rarely did so over the long run, to the point where it doesn't even matter anymore. There's nothing wrong with keeping the same average standards throughout. In fact, it's even better if those are kept and successfully carried out, but on the other hand, it's much harder to enjoy something that lowers its standards every step of the way. And I believe this is what bothers me the most about Memories of Phantasm, and what creates this feeling of being disappointed and wishing it was more. Because while it's admirable that Manpuku Jinja still manages to keep it going after all of those years, in spite of the trouble they have faced, what matters in the end is the whole show being enjoyable. And for Memories of Phantasm, this is definitely not the case the further and further it goes on. Not just because it starts to wear thin, but also because of a lack of planning ahead. Had it gotten a bit more time to cook, it may have been a great show to watch and enjoy. But, as it stands, to me, Memories of Phantasm is nothing short of a disappointing mess. And truly, I don't think I can say much more than what I've just told you right now. So, thank you very much for watching and listening to me ramble about that for such a long time, everyone. Hope you had a good one nonetheless, that you learned a bit about anime and animations, and overall, I certainly wish I have conveyed my viewpoint on the matter well enough. But with that, I'll wish you a very good rest of your day, or night depending on where you are, and as always, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.